The first cry went up just after dawn, when the sun was no more than a pale band bleeding into the horizon. By the time the townsfolk stumbled toward the cottonwood tree at the edge of Dust Creek, the desert light had grown sharper, and with it, the horror more vivid. She hung there, a girl no older than 20, her Sunday dress whipped thin by the morning wind, her small boots swaying above the earth. Her face, once promised for a new beginning, was now pale as bone, turned toward the sky as if begging it for mercy. Beside her, nailed into the bark, dangled a rough-hewn board, words carved with a hunting knife. "White men don't forgive." Mothers clutched their children back from a sight. Old miners muttered curses under their breath, spitting dust as if to wash the taste of fear from their mouths. Some crossed themselves, others only stared, whispering suspicions sharp enough to cut skin. "It's the immigrants," one said. "No," growled another, "it's some painted rock boys, trying to stir the fire." The sheriff arrived late, sweat already dripping from under his hat brim though the day was still cool. He squinted at the board, at the young bride's body twisting on the rope, and his jaws set hard, though his hands trembled around his belt. He barked orders to cut her down, but his voice carried little conviction. The men with knives glanced at one another, then stepped back. No one wanted to touch her, not yet. It felt like a curse hanging in the air. From the saloon porch, half the town looked on, merchants, farmhands, drifters nursing their hangovers. Every eye carried the same question, but none dared speak it. Who had done this, and why leave her so for all to see? The town's quiet unraveled into a low hum of suspicion, one neighbor glaring at another, every outsider now a threat. It was in this uneasy stillness that the rider came. A shape against the horizon at first, dust curling around him like smoke from a dying fire. He was bent in the saddle of a dun mare, shoulders sagged but steady, the kind of frame built on years of carrying more weight than one man should. His hat shaded most of his face, though the line of his jaw spoke of storms weathered and battles long past. His coat was frayed, boots dulled to gray. When he reached the outskirts, he reined up, saying nothing, eyes falling first on the girl swaying, then on the board that cursed her. The mare stamped, uneasy at the smell of fear. The man didn't move for a long while. He simply sat there, watching, until the murmurs of the townsfolk bent toward him, curious, suspicious, but too cautious to speak. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Ain't no place for wanderers this morning, friend. We got a matter on our hands." The stranger finally dismounted, boots sinking into the red dust. Up close, his face bore the weathering of decades, creased lines at the eyes, a scar that ran from ear to jaw like a riverbed cut into stone. His eyes, however, were bright and still, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and learned not to blink. He tipped his hat, not in respect but as acknowledgement, and walked closer. The crowd parted unconsciously, leaving him a narrow path to the tree. No one spoke when he crouched at the base of the cottonwood. His hand brushed the dirt, tracing faint scuff marks in the earth. His fingers brushed the heel prints that had dug deep in their last struggle. He rose slow, turned his gaze to the sheriff, then to the men gathered in tight knots of mistrust. "Rope's new," he said at last, his voice low but carrying across the hush. "Boards cut with a miner's blade, not an Apache's. Whoever did this wanted you to believe otherwise." The sheriff bristled. "That's so. You some lawman I ain't heard of." "No lawman," the stranger replied, his eyes already moving past the sheriff toward the town itself, its crooked street lined with false fronts, the saloon shutters creaking in the breeze, the blacksmith's hammer echoing faint in the distance. "Just a man who's seen this trick before." The crowd rippled with unease. The widow from the boarding house stepped forward, her apron stained with flour. "Then what does it mean?" she asked, voice quivering. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at the bride, at her lifeless face. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, not horror, but a shadow of recognition, like a memory buried under years of dust. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Best we bury her, quick and quiet. Folks got enough tension without stirring more." "A quick burial won't stop what's coming," the stranger said, and his tone carried no heat, only certainty. He turned and started walking toward town, the crowd stepping aside in silence as though some force unseen moved with him. The saloon doors squealed open when he pushed through. Inside, the air was thick with stale whiskey and last night's sweat. Card tables sat abandoned, chairs tilted askew, and the barkeep wiped at glasses he wasn't really cleaning. A few men lingered at the bar, whispering low. Their eyes cut toward the stranger and away again, quick as rattlers. He took a corner seat, the chair groaning beneath him. He didn't order, didn't speak. Just sat, listening, the brim of his hat shadowing half his face. The room shifted uneasily under his silence, men fidgeting with cards, boots tapping on the floorboards. Outside, the heat thickened. Dust skittered through the streets, curling around boots and wagon wheels. The town, usually alive with clatter by mid-morning, hushed itself into whispers and closed doors. Suspicion festered like rotten wood. Every immigrant family locked their shutters. Every ranch hand eyed his neighbor as though betrayal were certain. By noon, the widow from the boarding house came into the saloon. Her eyes darted once around the room, then settled on the stranger. She crossed quickly, sitting across from him without asking. "You saw it, didn't you?" she said, low but urgent. "Not just what they wanted us to see, but what really happened." He studied her for a moment, then gave the barest nod. "My husband's gone 2 years," she went on, words trembling but quick. "That girl, she came here with nothing but a promise and a letter. And now she's gone the same way." Her hand clenched the table edge. "This town's about to tear itself apart, and our sheriff's too scared to take a step." The stranger leaned back, chair creaking. "Fear's a weapon. Whoever left that girl swinging knew it." Her eyes searched his, desperate. "Then why are you here? Men like you don't drift in by chance." He didn't answer, though the silence stretched long, and she knew she had touched something buried deep. His gaze lifted past her to the window, where the wind pushed dust across the street, and in the distance, a group of riders passed slow, laughing too loud, their rifles glinting in the sun. The widow followed his eyes, her breath catching. "Them," she whispered. "The Painted Rock Gang." The stranger said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his hand brushed the worn grip of the revolver at his side, not as a threat, but as if assuring himself it was still there. Outside, the sheriff pretended not to see the riders. He lingered on the boardwalk, hands shoved deep in his pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. The gang's laughter carried, taunting, daring anyone to look up. The town obeyed in silence. From his corner seat, the stranger watched it all, eyes steady, expression unreadable. But within him, something coiled tight, waiting. His silence weighed heavier than any words, and though no one yet knew it, the course of Dust Creek had already shifted with his arrival. And as the sun began its slow fall westward, the girl's body still lay in the undertaker's parlor, untouched, unburied, her story demanding justice. The stranger's shadow lengthened across the saloon floor, and the town, though it did not yet understand, waited with bated breath for the storm he carried in his silence. By the next morning, Dust Creek was no longer a town but a powder keg waiting on a spark. The Painted Rock Gang had made sure of that. They drifted through the streets like wolves among sheep, their laughter cutting through the air, their words soaked in venom. They stopped at the livery to tell the stable hands it was the Mexican drifters who had strung up the bride. At the general store, they whispered it was the Irish miners. At the saloon, with whiskey burning their throats, they spat that it was the Sioux, prowling the hills. Each life found eager ears, eager tongues, and by dusk, men who had drunk side by side the day before now stared at one another as though one must be enemy. The board with its hateful carving was all anyone could talk about. Folks who had never seen a knife fight in their lives swore they could taste blood in the air. The gang's chaos spread like desert fire, and the sheriff did nothing but pace, wiping sweat from his brow. His badge gleamed in the sun, but it carried no weight, and everyone knew it. The widow found the stranger behind the livery, crouched low in the dust. He had his palm pressed to the earth, studying faint trails like a preacher reading scripture. Hoofprints, heel marks, a dragged line through the sand. None of it meant much to her, but the men read it as though the ground itself spoke to him. "You knew her, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He looked up, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. For a moment, he said nothing, and she thought he might send her away. But finally, his voice, gravelly and even, broke the silence. "I knew her name. Maria Weston. She came here on a promise that wasn't kept." The widow swallowed hard. She came by the boarding house the day she arrived. She carried letters, pages of them. She never sent them. "I read one, after." Her voice faltered, her hands tightening around the folds of her apron. She wrote of a man who told her this place was a land of new beginnings. She wrote about hope, about love, about wanting to build something in a world that gave her nothing. And then, Her words collapsed into the quiet between them. The stranger rose slowly, dust drifting off his knees. "Those letters still with you?" She nodded. "Locked away. I didn't want them burned with her. Felt like the only pieces of her that still breathed." He studied her with a long, unreadable look, then turned his eyes back toward the canyon road. She wasn't killed for who she was. She was killed for what she represented. A warning. A message. This gang means to split this town in two and watch it destroy itself. The widow's throat tightened. "And you, why do you care? You ride in out of nowhere. You watch. You listen. But why?" He didn't answer, at least not in words. He moved toward the canyon edge, his boots crunching the dry earth. She followed despite herself, watching him kneel again. His hand swept over faint markings the dust had tried to erase. "They dragged her body here," he said. "Two men, maybe three. One wore spurs. One's boot soles worn near through. They stopped here to carve that board, left their tracks in plain sight. No Indian does that." The widow shivered. "How do you know all this?" His gaze flicked to hers, steady and unwavering. "I've been both hunter and hunted. You learn to read the ground, or you don't last." That night, the gang came louder than before. They rode straight down the main street, torches in hand, whooping like devils, spitting their lies into every doorway they passed. "The sheriff won't protect you," they jeered. "The town's cursed. Only strength survives." They rode in circles until the dust choked the lungs of every child watching through shutters. Then they dismounted at the saloon and demanded drink, tossing coins that weren't theirs across the counter. The sheriff arrived, but he came alone, his rifle slung awkward in his arms. His voice cracked as he told them to stand down. They laughed, slapping his shoulder, daring him to pull the trigger. He lowered his rifle before he'd even raised it, the badge on his chest gleaming like a brand of shame. The townsfolk lined the street, silent, cowed, their eyes downcast. All except the widow. She stepped forward, chin raised though her hands trembled at her sides. "You think killing a girl makes you men?" she called, her voice trembling but clear. "You think this town will bow to your lies?" The gang turned on her, grinning with wolfish delight. Their leader, a thick-set man with a scar across his cheek, stepped close, his breath sour with whiskey. "Careful, missus," he sneered. "Widows don't live long talking bold." Before she could answer, another voice cut through the air, low but steady. "Leave her." The crowd shifted, heads turning. The stranger stood in the shadow of the livery, revolver at his side, his stance calm but unyielding. He hadn't drawn, but he didn't need to. His presence alone stiffened the air. The gang leader squinted, then chuckled. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" The stranger didn't answer. He only stepped closer, the boards under his boots groaning. His gaze never left the leader's eyes. The silence grew heavy, until even the horses stamped uneasily. The sheriff, emboldened by the distraction, tried again to speak, but his words died in his throat. The widow, though, moved to stand beside the stranger. Her shoulders were squared, her eyes burning. For the first time, the town saw not a weary woman or a drifter, but two figures holding the line when no one else would. The leader smirked, but his eyes narrowed as if weighing something he didn't want to admit. He spat in the dirt and turned back to his men. "This ain't done," he growled. They mounted up, their torches flickering in the wind, and with a final laugh, they thundered back toward the canyons, leaving Dust Creek in a silence thick with dread. The townsfolk trickled away, whispering again, but now with something different in their voices. Fear, yes, but also a faint flicker of something long buried. The widow looked up at the stranger. "You'll have to face them. You know that." His jaw tightened. "They've already set the fire. Question is how many burn before it's out." By dawn, rumors spread like wildfire. Farmers spoke of the bride's ghost haunting the cottonwood. Miners swore they'd seen riders in the hills carrying war paint. The immigrant families were warned to leave town before the lynchings began. The gang had done its work well, the town was splitting in two, and no one trusted anyone anymore. But in the quiet corners, hope clung stubbornly. Some whispered of the widow's stand, others of the stranger's calm. A blacksmith told his apprentice that maybe there was still a chance if someone was willing to fight. At midday, the stranger walked the edge of town, his eyes scanning every mark in the dirt, every broken branch at the canyon's mouth. The widow followed again, letters clutched in her hand. She pressed one into his palm. "Read this," she whispered. It was Maria's handwriting, delicate and steady. Asterisk, I believe in this place, in the men who waits for me. I believe that love can grow even in the desert, if only someone dares to plant it. Asterisk. The stranger folded the paper and slipped it inside his coat. His voice was low, almost avowed. Then we planted injustice. The wind carried the sound of hooves again, distant but growing. The gang was returning, louder, bolder. The stranger's hand rested on his revolver. The widow stood at his side, her eyes unflinching. The town watched from windows and porches, waiting to see if the day would end in fire or in the faintest flicker of hope. Dust Creek held its breath. The bride's death had been meant to divide them. Now, in the shadow of rising blood, the question was whether it would bind them instead. The night after the gang's last ride through town, the stranger saddled his mare beneath a half-moon that carved the desert in silver and shadow. He moved without noise, his coat hanging loose, his revolver gleaming dully in the pale light. No words left his lips, only a silence heavy with intent. By the time he rode out past the cottonwood, the townsfolk still slept restlessly, and only the widow knew he was gone. She was waiting at the boarding-house door, shawl pulled tight, the letters clutched against her chest. When she saw his dark figure slip away, she whispered a prayer, then snatched a lantern and followed, her boots crunching against the dirt as she hurried toward her own mare. She was no fighter, but she knew the weight of standing by someone when the rest of the world had turned its back. The desert swallowed them both. Canyons rose like jagged teeth, painted in blood and fire by the setting moon. Shadows pooled in every crevice, and the air smelled of dust and iron. The stranger rode with purpose, eyes fixed on the narrow pass where he knew the gang would come. He never looked back, but he knew she was there. Her lantern bobbed faint behind him, a small but stubborn flame against the night. At the canyon's heart, he dismounted, tethering his mare to a rock. He drew a circle in the dust with the toe of his boot, then sat at its edge, waiting. The widow came up behind him, breath quick, eyes wide. "You mean to fight them all?" she whispered. "They'll come looking for blood," he said, his voice steady as stone. "Better they spill it here than in the town." She wanted to argue, but something in his tone silenced her. Instead, she stood close, clutching the letters tighter. The canyon walls pressed in, and the silence grew thick until at last it broke, not by words, but by the echo of laughter. It came rolling down the stone like thunder, cruel and mocking, carrying with it the sound of hooves. Torches flared at the canyon's mouth. Shadows stretched long against the red rock, twisting into monstrous shapes. The Painted Rock gang rode in like kings of the desert, their rifles gleaming, their faces split by grins too wide for men who weren't devils. "Well, well," their leader sneered, pulling up on his reins. "The drifter thought to play hero. And look, he's even brought himself a widow to mourn him." The men roared with laughter. The widow's hand shook, but the stranger rose slowly, brushing the dust from his coat. He stepped forward into the circle of torchlight. His eyes were calm, his face unreadable, until he spoke. "You know me," he said, and his voice carried like a shot through the canyon. The gang fell quiet. A few frowned, squinting at him. Then one of them gasped, pale beneath the dirt. "Hellfire," the men muttered. "It's him. Kane McGraw." A ripple tore through the group. Kane McGraw, the gunslinger who disappeared a decade ago, after leaving trails of bodies from Abilene to the Rio Grande. A man so feared that mothers whispered his name to hush their children. It was said he'd been killed, shot down in a border town, but here he was, standing flesh and blood, his revolver heavy at his side. The leader tried to laugh, but his voice cracked. "Kane McGraw's dead." The stranger tipped his hat back, letting the moonlight touch the scar that cut across his jaw. "He was. Till you hung that girl." For a heartbeat, the canyon held its breath. Then the gang roared, but it was a roar of rage now, of fear masked in bravado. Rifles raised, hooves thundered as they spurred forward. Kane drew. The first shot cracked the silence, echoing off the canyon walls like a bell tolling doom. One rider fell hard, his torch spinning into the dust. Another came fast, swinging a rifle butt, but Kane sidestepped, his revolver spitting flame, and the men tumbled lifeless from his saddle. His movements were not wild but precise, each shot deliberate, each step measured. He was not a man in fury but a blade honed to deadly calm. The widow clutched her lantern, heart hammering, as the canyon filled with smoke and fire. Horses screamed, men shouted, but Kane moved through it all like shadow and lightning. He slid behind a boulder, reloaded with practiced ease, and stepped out to cut down 2 more before their rifles even rose. The leader bellowed orders, but his men faltered. They fired wild, bullets sparking against rock, but Cain was never where they aimed. His coat flared as he moved, his revolver steady, his eyes cold as winter steel. One outlaw tried to flee, spurring his horse toward the pass, but Cain's shot found the saddle horn, flipping him headlong into the dust. Another charged from behind, knife flashing, but the widow screamed, and Cain spun, the butt of his gun smashing the men to the ground. It was brutal, it was relentless, and yet it was not chaos. It was justice, grim, measured, inescapable. When the smoke thinned, only the leader remained, bleeding from a wound in his leg, crawling through the dust with hate burning in his eyes. Cain stood over him, revolver aimed steady, his breath slow and calm. "You framed them," Cain said. "The miners, the drifters, anyone who didn't look like you. You wanted the town to turn on itself." The leader spat blood, his teeth red. "That girl was nothing. A pawn. We strung her up to light the fire. And you," he coughed, choking. "You're still a killer, Cain McGraw. Always will be." Cain's finger twitched on the trigger. But before he could fire, the widow stepped forward. Her voice shook but carried in the silence. Maria was not nothing. She was hope. She was love. And she will not be forgotten. She dropped the letters onto the outlaw's chest. He looked down at the pages as his life bled into the dust. The words of the dead bride lay heavy on him, her handwriting soft against the blood-stained earth. His breath rattled, then stilled, and the canyon grew quiet again. Cain holstered his revolver. His shoulders sagged, not in weakness but in release, as though some weight he had carried for years finally slid from his back. The widow bent to gather the letters, pressing them close once more. By the time they rode back toward Dust Creek, the eastern sky was soft with dawn, painting the desert in gold. Smoke curled from the town's chimneys, cautious but steady. Folks would wake to news of the gang's fall, to whispers of Cain McGraw return from the dead. At the edge of town, the widow stopped her horse. Cain reined in beside her, his face unreadable beneath his hat. She held the letters tight and whispered, "She'll be remembered now." He nodded once, eyes on the horizon. Then he nudged his mare forward. He did not look back, and she did not call him to stay. As the sun broke, men gathered at the cottonwood where the hateful board still hung. Someone struck a match, and flames climbed its rough edges, devouring the words until they fell to ash. The widow stood apart, clutching the letters of the girl who had come seeking love and found only death, her tears shining in the morning light. And far on the ridge, a lone rider moved west, his shadow stretching long, his name once again a legend whispered in the dust.